Bengaluru, Ministry of Culture, Government of India. It gives us immense pleasure to welcome you to today's online art appreciation session. This session is part of a special series that explores the lives and legacies of 9 iconic masters from the National Gallery of Modern Art, Bengaluru collection. Today, we are honored to focus on Nicholas Roerich, a visionary artist, mystic and cultural thinker whose work bridged Russian folklore, spiritual philosophy, and the landscapes of Central Asia and the Himalayas. Internationally known for designing the sets and costumes for Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring in 1913, Roerich later devoted his life to painting and spiritual exploration. After extensive travels across Europe, America, and Asia, he settled in Kulu Valley in India, where he created thousands of luminous, symbol-rich paintings inspired by Himalayas. His work continues to resonate across art, philosophy, and cultural history, influencing thinkers, artists, and explorers alike. We are privileged to have with us Ms. Yamini Thelkar, an esteemed Indian art specialist, as the speaker for the session. With over 30 years of experience in art world, Ms. Thelkar has collaborated with prestigious museums and cultural institutions across the country. Her expertise spans modern and contemporary Indian art, as well as traditional folk art practices. Ms. Thelkar's recent work includes curating the acclaimed art program at Terminal 2 of the Bengaluru International Airport. She continues to serve as a consultant for leading art galleries and public art initiatives across India. Her academic credentials include a Masters of Philosophy, MPhil in Art and Aesthetics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, a Masters in Ancient Culture from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from JJ School of Art, Mumbai. We look forward to an enriching session as Ms. Thelkar takes us through the life, philosophy, and artistic journey of Nicholas Roerich, a visionary whose work continues to inspire generations of artists and scholars. Welcome you again, ma'am. It's always a pleasure to have you here. And today, I'm sure it is an exciting, very elaborated, to talk on, of course, Nicholas Roerich, who has a deep connection with India, and later on, his son Satislav Roerich was married to Devika Rani, which also is very much rooted here in Bangalore because they lived here, and also a pedagogical connection because he was also part of Chitrakala Parishad, who shaped, the whole fine art academic syllabus, not only for Chitrakala Parishad, but also to the Kava College, which is in Mysore. So, welcome you today, and I request you to take us from here. You're mute.
Sorry. Darshan, thank you for that wonderful introduction and setting the context for this talk. Um, Thank you, NGMA Bangalore, for kind of hosting this series. Very patient because these were 9 sessions spread across 9 months, where each month we spoke about an artist who was deemed as a national art treasure, and I think this was. It was for me also personally to be able to revisit those artists, revisit the artworks, and share these stories, with the audience over here. Uh, I mean, today's artist poses a unique challenge. I was just talking to Darshan. There is so much of information and there's so much of material that, forget 1 hour. You will need multiple sessions just to unravel every aspect of what he did as an artist and how his journey unfolded. And he was a prolific creator. I mean, there are many other artists also who are prolific creators, but here was an artist who was prolific not only in his works, but also, his life, how he wrote, what he did. So, without much delay, let's start, Darshan, on the presentation. So, a heads up, the presentation includes about 34 slides, and it will take you through his life journey. It is kind of a abbreviated version. There is more that will be there. So I hope there are questions, something that you've read, and we can have a fantastic discussion. I will try and wrap it up within 45 minutes so that we can have some time for discussion. Yeah. So as I begin with, what is the national art treasures? National art treasures is something that is unique to India in the way it is deployed. There are other countries across the globe who have this concept of national treasures or national artists or national art forms. In India, we have designated 9 artists as national art treasures. The first of the 4 were identified and recognized in the year 1976. These were Rabindranath Tagore, Jamini Roy, Amrita Shergill, and Nandalal Bose. None of them were alive at that particular point in time. Then there was a second circular which came out in 1979, and 5 more artists were added to it. These were Raja Ravi Verma, Gaganendranath Tagore, Abhinendranath Tagore, Nicholas Roerich, and Sailoz Mukherjee. After 1975, we've never had any opportunity or any listing of artists who were considered as national art treasures. Now, you know, for me, this poses a challenge. One, why nothing after 1979? And who, defined these artists, who identified artists? Mind you, I'm not questioning the validity or the depth or, how should I say, why these artists were selected. I mean, they're phenomenal artists. They have contributed. No denying that. My questioning only comes in why these. It's not to say that these are the only 9 artists. There are more also who were there. And the final piece of the mystery for me is that this comes under the, Archaeological Survey of India, the circular, or, the the whole concept of this act is under Archaeological Survey of India under the Antiquities and Treasures Act. A very interesting combination because Archaeological Survey of India has no dealing, no connection with art. Forget modern and modern art practice, or at that point it was even not even defined as modern art. It was just like a broad uh, panorama which said like these are artists who do paintings. So where is this thing coming from? In my head, I have two, at least one part of the thing is okay. Let's say that it is under the Antiquities and Treasures Act. There was a need to say that you can't have all your valuable or important painting that define art practice in India going out of the country. So you have them in. That's one way of looking at it. But when it comes to who defined it and who identified it, I have two candidates. One is, of course, the Tsarina of art and culture in India, which was Popul Jaikar, who was also the advisor to the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. It is quite possible that she, would have done it because I haven't been able to find out any kind of documents that relate to a circular, a notice, or something that approval that says that, okay, these artists are signed off and who's done that. Or the other person could be Lakshmi Prasad Sihare, who was part of ASI, then part of the National Museum and the National Gallery, who knew or who was well versed, with the whole gamut of art and culture. So this is a mystery, and I hope at some point I'm able to, resolve and find these, and then I can come back as a rejoinder and say this is what is. But nevertheless, I think it is important, and it is, something that we should be proud of, that for a nation that was still in its fledgling state and kind of trying to resolve multiple social and economical and practical challenges, art and culture formed a part of the thought process of the power corridors of the ministries. And these artists have been nominated as national art treasures. We celebrate them today, and their works cannot leave the shores of the country. We cannot, you know, sell them overseas. They have to remain within the bounds of the country. So I think that is something that is phenomenal. So now we come to the artist on focus today, which is Nicholas Roerich. He was born in Russia in St. Petersburg to a fairly affluent family. His father was a lawyer, he was the eldest son, and there was an expectation that he should, study law or go to the army. We're talking of the year 18, in the later half of 19th century. He was born in 1874. It was also the time when there was a lot of change and turmoil that was going on in Russia itself. Nicholas was pretty, how should I say, smart or a genius child because he did something very interesting. His father never would have agreed to him, studying art because he was interested in art and he was interested in archaeology and he was interested in reading and, the whole thing of history. So he does during the day he studies at the university. He's studying law, and then he takes up in classes in the evening to study art. And as a hobby, as a child, he had started doing excavations in the place where he stayed. He was interested in the history of Russia and what was the past. And I'm not saying past that goes into hundred of years, but into decades and centuries ago. And he used to collect objects, study them in a very precise manner. So even as a child, what you have is somebody who is, uh, you know, a, a polymath, to say the least. Studied to be a lawyer, studied to be a painter. Archaeology was a subject of deep interest. History was something that was very, very, very again, deep into archaeology, history. And he created something in his work, which, art would be the focus of his life, something that was so unique. And some of his early paintings that you have, which go back to the later, even while he was a student, one of his paintings was given an award. The early series of paintings that he did were, like this one is called Stone Age in Russia. Then there is something pagan worship of Russia. What he was trying to do was to build an identity for his country, which spoke about its, the depth and the richness of culture and how far back it went into time. And he had a style of painting that was not only academically realistic style, but something that he kind of looked at multiple other sources, and he did not hesitate. After having a practice, I mean, he managed to do art. He became a full-time painter because he proved that he could do that. Unfortunately, his father passed away while he was young, and in the year we jump to the year 1917. This is the time when there is the Bolshevik revolution, and he, to kind of move away from all the turmoil which was happening, he moves with his family to what is now known as Finland. I mentioned family over here. There is a very important person in his life, his wife and his partner, Helena, who becomes very important. Why is she important? Because like Rorik, she was also highly intelligent. She came from a family which was, continued to be affluent and had access to a whole lot of books. So she was not only accomplished in music, she was also a painter. And by the time she was 16, hear this, she had read the Vedas, she had read the Mahabharat, she had read, a few of the Upanishads, and she was completely immersed in the study of what was then known as the Orientalism. Though publicly and in history we talk a lot about Rorik, and Helena continues to be a part of it always, but it was something that was a choice, and also the society at that point, where it was always Rorik who Nicholas Rorik who was at the forefront, and Helena was his the silent partner, if you can say. But she was hugely instrumental in defining the path, or in supporting and creating the whole legacy of Rorik, which is there. And two of his sons, Darshan mentioned Svetsvala, who stayed in Bangalore and who was instrumental in the academic foundation of art schools. They had an elder son, George, who was, I'm in awe of, was a multilinguist, which is to say, and it was a conscious decision. He studied, I think he was proficient and a master in 5 languages, which included Sanskrit, Pali, Chinese, of course, English, German, and he was conversant in 20 languages of Asia, particularly of the regions of Tibet. So Tibetan was one of them, and Mandarin was a part of it. And the reason, I'll tell you why he studied all these languages, but he was also very critical, to the whole again, legacy identity of what is Nicholas Roerich, because the vision or the desire which the Roriks had altogether was something that was unified. And as a family, I think they achieved something that was very phenomenal. So, what I'm showing you is, a journey of his paintings. I'm not going linear. It's very difficult to go linear. I'm going to go back and forth and show you multiple things which is there. And I see I'm already 20 minutes into time and I'm still stuck at the very beginning part of it. But anyway, it's interesting and we'll see how it goes. So while he was in still in Russia at that point, and then later on even in Berlin, Finland, like it was mentioned early on by Darshan, that he did a lot of backdrop paintings for opera, the Russian opera. And these were again path breaking. And there's one incident which says that the opera itself, the Spring, was so popular that when it was shown for the first time in Paris, the audience went stir crazy. They were shouting, there was clapping. Some of them broke out into fights because they could not handle what they were seeing. It was so path breaking and so different from what they had seen. And Rorik was part of that movement where they were changing how you saw things, in traditional format and to a new vision. And this is, I'm going to show you another one, which is part of the backdrop. Again, if you see, Rorik at this particular stage was still building an identity, a national identity, looking at the past and trying to position and portray what was the culture of Russia, the cultural aspect of Russia. But there's another aspect to it that kind of slowly started creeping into his work, which is his obsession with India, his obsession with Orientalism, his obsession with philosophy of the East, and particularly the Himalayas. They had a huge overpowering presence in his life, and that came through form of landscapes. So even if you don't know that comes with a spiritual background, or this was painted by a Russian, whenever you look at his paintings, you always feel the sense of majesty, the power, the calm, there's something that moves you about it. I don't know if many of you have been to Kulu, Nagar particularly, but when you walk into the space which is there, it's mind blowing because you get to see it all. You get to see it all within the ambience of the home that was there, of the center which was there, and the place which is in. I mean, even in Chitrakala Parishad in Bangalore, there are many of Rorik's paintings which are there. And again, every time you visit, it is an overwhelming experience, and there's a whole body of it. And this continues. And this particular painting I think he painted when he'd not even visited India. It was based on his dreams that he had, and that becomes an important part. Theosophy, or the Theosophical Society as we call it in India, was something that was very critical in his life, and it shaped who he was. It shaped his purpose in life and what he wanted to do. And so when he's painting the mountains, or when he's painting, uh, you know, anything, it is infused not by, um, things of realism, things of perspective only, but there is a deep burning desire that comes through in his work, and that is what you see in his paintings. Initially, he used to always paint oil on canvas, but when he comes to India, there's a change in that also. I now come to another. It's not that he only painted pretty pictures and landscapes or backdrops. There is a, there is a series of paintings which he painted, which were, very disturbing, and they were, based on his visions. This particular painting is called "The Angel's Last Message." If you see, the figure resembles somebody from the Russian icons, and it is, surrounded by a billowing fires. There is fire, there's smoke. He's talking about the impending doom. It's prophetic almost, because this is just before the World War. This was painted sometime in 1914, and 1912 or 1913, not 14. And then you have the outbreak of war. So there was, people might not agree to it, but he accepted and he acknowledged that he had messages that he would hear, which he would then translate into poems or paintings that would immediately come on. Interestingly, throughout his life, Rorik used to have a very busy day, meeting people, reading, and whatever. He would paint from midnight to 4 in the morning. That was his standard routine, and this he did throughout his life. It is interesting to know that despite, the kind of activities that he had, it is believed that there are about 7,000 paintings that he painted throughout his life. And these paintings are there, of course, in India. We have them. There's a large collection which is there in the Rorik Museum, which he set up in the year 1923 in New York. Then there was another museum in Russia which is there, and you can see them in institutional collections, because he was very conscious of how he worked and what happened to the paintings. You have, I spoke about paintings which were very disturbing, very, you may see, why is he painting that? Because these are things which bother him, and the reason he's painting that is to kind of warn the viewers, to say that this is what is coming, but you have to be careful. And then on the other hand, you say he also did landscapes. But that is the challenge that Rorik faced as an artist, because what his belief was that art is something that can bring in world peace, and he really believed in it. And what did he do for that? Uh, he set up institutes, training institute in Russia. He would write about poetries. He would give lectures, and his vision to create or to find, what is known as Shambhala, or the promised utopian land. But before we come to that, I get carried away with what all he did. So, but just to kind of take you through his life also, from Finland, he moves out because when he left his home in Russia, he wasn't able to, take with him his belongings, the money which was there. He had to leave everything behind, and they had nothing on them. From Finland, he then has an opportunity to go to London, where again he does theater backdrops. There's some painting sales that happen. He has an opportunity to go to India. Mind you, going to India for a Russian was not easy, because India was under the British rule at that point. And given the political scenario, to get a visa, to get the funding, it was difficult, and he didn't have money. For a huge, periods of his time, managing finances was always a challenge. But he's written that every time there was a difficulty and he felt that things would be going bad, there's always somebody who's come in, and this is their belief in the master, and this is the, that they were guided. And Helena also had a very strong belief in that, and they were always finding people who then move, help them move from one point to another. For instance, they were able to move from Finland to London, and they thought that maybe they will go to India from there fairly easily. While they were in London, they met Rabindranath Tagore, and literally like on the streets of London, and that was how their connection grew, and they became, and they were aware of Rabindranath Tagore, aware of Gitanjali, and they had a fantastic friendship that was forged with Rabindranath Tagore. And Rabindranath Tagore invites them. They feel, yes, we will have the money and the opportunity, go to India. The reason, of course, they wanted to experience India, the land where there was so much of spirituality and guidance that could be sought for people, but also to undertake this travel, the expedition, which was between Mongolia, the Gobi Desert, and to locate and to find this, the land of Shambhala, which was there. But while they were in London, again they had a diversion, and they got an opportunity to go to New York and not to India. They said, okay, let's go to New York, gather resources and then move on to India. So they land in New York in the year 1921. And while they are there in New York, immediately they start setting up the Institute for Art, because Rorik firmly believed that art had the power to, to heal people of physical illness and also mental illness, which he called as crime. And he kind of pushed for the inclusion of art in factories, in schools, hospitals, public spaces. One of the things that we talk about today, that art in public spaces is critical. And here was somebody who understood the power of art over 100 years ago and was championing for it. And then he has exhibitions over there to raise funds. The works travel all over the Americas, and he has a very powerful response to it, and he manages to garner resources to travel to India. And by this time, his son, George, who's in London, who's in Oxford, studies and comes back, is very, is multilingual, and they set sail for India, finally in the year 1923. They arrive in Mumbai. And sorry, while I do that, let me change the slides and show you. So, there's another thing. I'm going to take a break and move on from the linear narration to look at his art and his paintings. What I find interesting is that whenever he's painting the mountains, of course the mountains is the most dominating aspect of his painting, and it takes up almost 90 to 95% of the space. And the human figure is somewhere in the corner. It's at the lower right, lower left, sometimes not even visible. And I think that, and the viewpoint, is always uh, as if he is like, at a higher level himself, and he's facing those mountains. Uh, just to draw a quick comparison, when you look at Bireshwar Sen's mountains, there are also those tiny paintings of the Himalayas, but the way he paints them is so distinct and different from what Nicholas Roerich, kind of is painting over here. And remember, I said that there is a change that happens in his medium. He moves from canvas to using a lot of tempera in his works, because he believes that's something that's more, aligned to it. Not that everything goes to tempera, there's tempera and canvas that continues to be in his works. And of course, now coming back to why India and where does he go. So from India, they come to Bombay and then they go to Calcutta. While they're in Calcutta, again, a funny story, an anecdote. they somehow can't find Rabindranath Tagore's address, the actual address that they need to go to. They say, "Oh, it's okay, he's such a dominating and he's an important figure. Sure, people in Calcutta know, why are we worried?" So they sit in the taxi. And as it happens, I think they spend the whole day going around in circles because they're taken to, some other Tagore, to whatever it is. But it's not easy for them to read. And suddenly, somewhere, one person in the family remembers what street he lives in, and they're taken to the correct place in that they need to reach. Unfortunately, when they reach there, Tagore was in China at that point. They don't meet him, but they meet the family. They are welcomed warmly, and they meet the rest of the intelligentsia, which is there in Thakurbadi along Rabindranath Tagore. Anyway, coming back to our more main focus. From here, from Calcutta, they embark on their journey of uh, the whole quest to find Shambhala. And it's a journey that lasts for 5 years. It is not easy. It is a time when they're traveling on foot or they are on horseback. There is a lot of suspicious that is going on because, you've just finished one war, and these are Russians who are traveling through China, through Mongolia, you know, through the whole regions of the Himalayas. Is it for espionage? The British authorities are keeping a track on that and they're questioned repeatedly throughout that. But they do have the documentation clear. They have the funding of the Americans. Now, can you imagine a Russian having a funding from the Americans to travel, undertake an expedition of the region? Officially, the reason why they were traveling is to, for purpose of archaeology, to find the teachings or the relics of the great masters of the East, and to document that region, to document you know the finds from there. Now, this was a plausible story, the first front story, and why the Americans would support it is because the Natural History Society in the US had had funded a expedition a few years earlier, and that's where they found one of the first dinosaur eggs, and it became something that was highly popularized and celebrated. So they thought, yes, this is possible. But only people in the closest of the close circles, along with Rorik, which was about four more people, knew that the real reason why the Roriks were keen to go to this region was to establish a new country. And it would have been the new Shambhala, which would be a country based on concepts of peace, concepts of brotherhood, unity, and art. And he repeatedly said that art has the power to to unite people, to bring in peace, because he'd seen so much of war, turmoil, and the need to find something that was soothing and bringing people together was this, and hence this expedition. And of course, a lot of suspicion all across, but they managed to complete it successfully. And the kind of works that come out of it are amazing. But before we go on to that, I don't think it would have been possible for an artist, especially somebody like Rorik, who was so open and so in awe of all things Indian, that he would not have looked at Indian paintings. And he's gone on record of saying that the miniatures have impacted me. How? If you look at it, this is a very popular miniature of a Naika, where she's kind of about to go and to meet her lover, and how the deer stops her. So this is his interpretation of it, and he says that the very concept of flattening, that is moving away from realistic rendition, moving away from the use of heavy impasto oil, and moving on to something that is more two-dimensional, was something that was important. And therefore, I brought in these two paintings to show that the level of impact and how he analyzed and how he incorporated it in his works. And then again, you kind of see I'm not going to go back again because we have about another 10 to 15 minutes for me to go through another half set of my slides. So this kind of, you can kind of see the expanse of flat colors that kind of slowly start coming into his paintings. This is again from the expedition. He kept on painting because, remember, for a person who was always strapped for funds, his paintings became an important source of revenue and how he would support his further travels. So he constantly was painting while he was also documenting. He was also doing excavations and bringing in collections. The other aspect of this thing was to collect relics, to collect objects, and to put them in his museum. The the museum. So apart from the Roerich Museum, which was about his art and his writings, he wanted to create a museum, or he had established the museum, the framework for the museum called Corona Mundi, which was the crown of the world, and where he wanted all civilizations' monuments to be under one umbrella, so people understood that there is this whole unity which is there through art. So that's why the paintings, again, I'm talking about the dream of the new country which was there, to create something that would be unifying. And again, if you notice over here, there is this whole kind of flatness that gently creeps into it. It's not completely flat, but there are glimpses of it that you see in the way he manages the forms throughout the paintings. Again, the thing that I mentioned, that over here the figure is not the focus. It's all the mountains, the beauty of the mountains bathed in beautiful light, and then you have this little figure at the base. He's literally like showing us how insignificant we are in the larger scheme of things. There's another thing that happens for Rorik. And again, I'll use an anecdote over here. In the year 1961, when the Russian astronaut Yuri, forgetting his last name, had come back from outer space, he was asked, "How does the Earth look?" And he made a very interesting comment. He says, "It reminded me of Nicholas Rorik's painting." But by that point, very few people were aware of Nicholas Roerich, even in Russia, even in the Americas, because what had happened was that his trip to his expedition in Tibet, in the Gobi Desert, in everywhere, had raised a lot of suspicions. The very fact that he was getting funding from donors from the USA was looked at with great suspicion. And what he had done was, which I'm going to quickly jump to through the paintings. I mean, the paintings are beautiful. We can keep looking at them and talking about them. But I want to kind of jump across to to this, and then I'll take you back again. Was his peace pact? He made you know it, the culmination of his ideology and his thought was that there has to be a peace pact. What is this? It's this symbol. It's universal and it is acknowledged even today. The three circles within the ring signify two things: past, present, future, or art, religion, and science encircled, enclosed in this one unit that is the earth or the world which is there. To begin with, he made this first in 1931, but by the time it was 1935, there was a document, a peace pact, or the cultural pacts that was created, which was signed by the then President Franklin Roosevelt and 9 other countries in South America. This peace pact was to protect the monuments, artifacts which were in across the globe. And strangely, this also becomes a reason for suspect that happens. In 1937, he is banned in the United States of America, he cannot enter the country. Mind you, this is in New York. There is a whole lot of collection of his artworks which are there, housed in a museum. He has set up, the Institute of Art over there. There is another museum that's going to take place, but he cannot access any of it. And then simultaneously, at that particular point in time, he's under the radar of the KGB because they don't understand why he needs to do, uh, you know, these expeditions. What is he talking about? Because he openly talks about the messages that he receives from the master, his talk for peace, his work of bringing art, science together, setting up, the murmur of setting up of a new country also is kind of taking place. And that becomes problematic. And he is rendered homeless. But I don't think he looked at it in that way because for him, his um, emotional or his spiritual home was India. And he had, coming back to, you know, his influence. I'm going to come back over here, where he has set up Uruswati, which is in what I mentioned earlier, in Kulu, in Nagar, which is a center for research, where they're inviting people from diverse backgrounds, be it scientists, poets, philosophers, artists, to come together and to do research. Research about what? Research not about things that we know, because they believe that there is more to the world than what you physically see, the energy field, the energy source, the unknown. How do you bring about this into the realm of the masses so that they can understand it? And that was what they were researching for. And that was what Uruswati Center was. But unfortunately, it didn't last for a long time for multiple reasons. Funding was, of course, one of them. But there were other challenges also, and it stopped. But Rorik continues to live in Kulu till the time of his death, and even today it is maintained as uh, as a museum, and people go and visit it. And again, I would like to touch upon Helena Rorik's influence. Like I said, you know, she was the one who kind of held it all together. She she was a prolific writer, and she was somebody who was extremely sensitive, and somebody who was deeply spiritual, and she was the one who kind of, how should I say, gave the support or was the vision in many of those projects kind of taking place. Which now brings me to the question. I would like to, again, I've gone through the whole thing. Why was a Russian honored, with as a national art treasure of the country? I think one of the reasons, if you look at it like that, if you look at it from the perspective of identity and geopolitics and political boundaries, if you ask what was the passport that he held, he continued to have a Russian passport, and he did not. Um, I don't think it even occurred to him, or he did not apply for an Indian passport. His son Svetsfulav did. He was, he naturalized to an Indian citizen, but Nicholas didn't. But he didn't even ever want to go back to Russia and settle down there. Though there are two museums, one by the government and one as per their followers, that there was a museum that was established in Russia. But unfortunately, about 25-30 years ago, the museum was taken over by the official government. uh, you know the original management was stopped from entering. They were banned, and they couldn't kind of work the way it was. They reorganized the museum and changed the narrative completely. So I think uh, how should I say, it was absolutely fine that he continued to stay in India because he found his home. he found his peace while he was in India, while he was in Kulu. And that, the desire to go back was never there. And he continued to paint, and his paintings, I think, evoke or express his philosophy, his ideology, and his belief, which was quite simply this, that he believed in the power of art. He believed in the power of art as a universal language. He believed that art was something that could heal people. And he believed that art was also something for the future. And he had the sensitivity to look into the past as to the heritage that he came from. Because if you look at his journey, he began as a painter of Russian landscapes, of Russian stories, of Russian history, and building up, the glory of the nation, not in terms of saying that, oh, the Russians are the best, but in saying that what is it that Russians had and what are the powerful things there. He looked at things like pagan worship, he looked at folk, tribal, the ancient past, and he tried to bring it into the current times. He believed that art had to be for peace. And then gradually he realized when he met Helena that his quest was really not restricted to a particular geographical location, but it was something that went beyond for humanity. In that, I think with Helena and with his own work also together, he was drawn towards what is Oriental or what Eastern philosophy. He was drawn towards the Upanishads, to the texts which were largely India, and also Buddhism, which drew his attention from a geography to the world. And in that, the anchor was the Himalayas, the anchor was Buddhist thought, the anchor was, how do I make life for mankind better? And he used his way of thinking to which was to bring in together knowledge and art together, but knowledge not only which was you know academic knowledge, but knowledge which would help people understand the powers of the universe, and to take it. And he lived that dream throughout his life, moving from Russia to Finland to London to New York, and then finally in India. I think, therefore, it's not surprising that a country like ours, which has got so much of multiplicity and diversity, should should acknowledge, should honor an artist who looked at all these things which resonate with what the country stands for, and not look into the things, oh, does he hold what passport he holds, but look at what his contribution for. And I think in that sense, it's something that was completely, you know, uh, valid and perfect, that he should be acknowledged as a master, a national art treasure. And the last painting that I, have for you is this painting that is titled Shambhala. Shambhala is imaginary, is something that what you believe it can be. And again, I find it interesting that in this particular thing, there is a figure, and it is called the let or the arrow towards Shambhala, that somebody's already climbed up and is pointing the arrow down, possibly finding the place, possibly marking that place amongst the mountains. And it is, this painting is painted in 1946. He passed away in 1947. Towards the end of it, where he's kind of, it's the setting sun or the rising sun, if you want to choose to call it, where this figure who finds that place. With this, I end my little, uh, you know, talk on Nicholas Roerich and his work and his contribution. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Um, I mean, Nicholas is somebody who can, go on and on, because I think today there is something called, we refer to as a creator. So I think, somewhere we have to refer to Nikhil Roerich as a creator, because, and also his family's contribution. his two sons, George, who was also in Tibet and try to, you know, bring together the cultural and the spiritual, uh, and he also, did a lot of dictionaries shared across things. And here in southern part, Sethaslo Rorik, who also looked up his father's Kulu museum and things like that. And there are many other, things which he's written on Agni and things like that.
Mm.
I mean, also, and there are many compilations of different articles from all over the world which came under publications under Nicholas Roerich. So that is something which is amazing. And I mean, we don't get to see much of paintings, uh, and also what you shared is something which is getting through apart from everybody, having a sense of the Himalayan painting. So, I mean, ideally, we all connect to the Himalayas, but this aspect of, why it is and how it is coming is something very important. And also,
Yeah.
Helena plays an important role. That was quite beautiful. And I mean, the era is something very important for India. And also, it contributed towards the independence because it all, somewhere connect to each other after meeting Rabindranath Tagore. So it
Correct.
was a wonderful session and very enlightening to look at, somebody from Russia going all around the world, coming back, something very interesting.
Yeah, no,
So,
absolutely.
so
Because,
trying to look at it. Yes, please go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
So, shooting one question.
Ah, somebody's surprised by the idea of creating a country for art. Yes, absolutely. I think if that would have been done, um, we would have had a very different. I think the art world and the art community would have been different. Also, it was not necessarily only for art, but that was one of the ways of kind of creating something. Where art would have played an important role in every policy making. I mean, also if you look at our constitution, and I keep going back to it when we spoke about Nandalal Bose, how we said that he created the art into the constitution. It's only befitting that a country which commissions artists to create paintings specifically for their constitution should also kind of honor an artist who's not defined by his identity of a passport, but with the idea and how he aligned to the nation to do something. I think this is something quite phenomenal. It is kind of now making me think, saying that we should look at which other country has done something like that, because then it questions the whole thing. Look at it this way: it is national art treasures, and yet you have a Russian who is a national art treasure.
Mm.
So that shows about the how we embrace people in our fold and kind of take it forward in and create a legacy that is so unique and different. So yeah, it's only befitting that we have that. I wish that country would have been formed, and then we would have had something different.
So it recalls me when I was a student in Baroda. So, my tutors were Deepak Kanalji and Jairam Pudwalji. When we used to go to, I mean, to Ajanta or Ellora, a kind of feeling of, bringing that sense of, how history and the mythology, how it played. So they always said, you people are the fresh eye. You usually come here and go, so we miss out a lot of things. So you please go ahead and tell us what is new. What does your eye tell you?
Mm,
Uh, in that sense, how people look at India from a outside, a fresh eye to it, and
yeah.
also absorb so much, things and bring it out is something very. And it is art is so diverse as our culture, so that is quite interesting. So much of
Mm,
amalgamation of many things coming together and the observations of it.
mm.
So,
Where can one find all his? No, you can't find them all in one collection because they are, kind of spread across, which is in a way good because each of the regions, then his vision kind of gets met. If you go online, though, the Rorik Center, which is at the Rorik Museum in New York, they have a fairly good collection of the visual repository which is there. Of course, if you're in Bangalore, you can go to the Chitrakala Parishad. You get to see that. If you happen to be in Delhi, and NGMA itself has a good collection. Delhi, it gets split between the two. But if you're in Banaras, there's a whole gallery which is there in the Banaras Hindu University of Nicholas Roerich. Then where else can you see? I think there are a few in Mysore also, a couple of them, not all. But if you want to see them all, you need to go to, and I think online is a good resource to see them all together. But
I think
physically, it is.
Patna Museum have a few of Nicholas Rorik's paintings. About
Sorry?
19 of them. I think Patna Museum has about 19
Patna
Rorik
Museum, yes.
paintings.
Yes.
Some
Yes.
letters written.
And
Uh,
of course, if you go to Kulu, you get the whole experience in Nagar, Uruswati. Why is Nicholas Roerich important in Indian art? I think he's important because he brings in, he embodies the cultural legacy, the spiritual legacy of art practice in India. And he embraced it completely, and he lived in Kulu. The center was open for a whole lot of artists and people who were interested in study, in kind of spreading the word. So in that perspective is important. Also the time that he was living in, this is, we're talking pre-independence. He came to India in 1923, and from 1923 onwards, for the next 24 years, he spent his life in India entirely. uh, you know and again, his contribution is, of course, one, towards painting, but second is in creating a space which was very different. Today we can talk about different streams coming together, art and science being part of their conversations that are happening. He allowed, or he created that space where you had scientists, philosophers, and artists coming together and to talk about it and to take it to a larger forum, larger audience. So, in that sense, yes, he's important because he takes a particular aspect of Indian culture, works on it across the globe. Any other artist who's drawn Himalayas? Yes, there are lots of artists who've drawn Himalayas. One that I mentioned is Bireshwar Sen, who did a lot of paintings on the Himalayas. Then there is, now immediately names don't come to my mind. Who else is there? I mean, his son also has done paintings on the Himalayas. Then there is this artist, Sarabjit Singh, who's done Himalayas in a very fascinating. Again, NGMA has a beautiful collection of Sarabjit Singh. There is Darshan, help me out here. Huh?
this is his painting, Sarabjit Singh, what I know.
Yes, absolutely, Sarabjit Singh. Oh, fantastic painting of Sarabjit Singh. I just love the artist. Who else? I mean, there are many others. Are there Indian artists today who you feel carry forward Roderick's idea of landscapes as inner experience? Yes, there are. There was this artist. There's one which immediately comes to my mind when you talk about landscapes is Paramjit Singh. Then there was this artist who did huge landscapes, who was based in Canada. Name eludes me, but I'll come back to you with that name. Then there was, Sohan Kadri, whose work is based in spirituality, and it is landscapes, done in a completely different manner. There is Ram Kumar who does that with a particular space, and again goes on to do landscapes in a completely different manner. Uh,
But I think just to add, the Himalayan mountains. I think after photography, largely today also people go there. It's always calling heavily in the sense of the spiritual and to go there to spend time is something always. It is even today.
Yeah,
It is the mountains always call the today. The bikers
yeah,
go there. Yeah.
yeah,
So I have one more question. So
yeah. One more. Elaborate more on the comparison about Rorik's perspective on mountains and the other artists. Uh, on Himalayas? No, sorry, I didn't. Which other artists? I'm a little bit lost. Do you want me to make a comparison between the way Rorik painted? Oh, Bireshwar Sen. Sorry. So what I was talking about, okay, I got the question. So when Rorik paints the Himalayas, or when Rorik paints the mountains, um, you know, there is, how should I say, he tries to bring in the magnitude of the space. He tries to immerse us into the landscape of it, and he uses a very different perspective for us to do that. Like, there is, again, the entire picture is sorry, the entire painting is, how should I say, occupied by the mountains itself, and there's a human figure that comes in. When I look at Bireshwar Sen's painting, it is the same. It is the same mode. It is about the mountain, and the human figure also comes in. But there, the difference is, Bireshwar Sen is entirely and completely looking through scale in a different manner. He uses small postcards, which is about 4 by 2.5 inches, and in that he paints the mountains, where he makes the scale go miniature, and in that there is one little dot of a figure. So here, both the artists talk about the power of the mountains, but one is using, like Bireshwar Sen reduces it further to show us the scale, but Rorik uses the space to show that we are close to the mountain, and so that we can almost feel, once you've gone to the mountains, you can never forget the feel, the atmospheric feel which is there. And it never comes across that much in even in your photographs. It's something that you experience, it's something that you live through, and that is what Rorik is trying to capture through his works. It is, both are spiritually inclined, but both use different devices to talk about the, that one common thread which is there, the whole magnitude and the power of mountain, and how it makes you feel as a human being confronting that mountain. I don't know if you got that. Yes, that's absolutely right. Indian culture and heritage, not only Hindu but also Buddhist. So like Krishna plays a larger role into it, but Buddhism also.
I think that's all the questions. What came us on the comment box. So I'm even last check on the Instagram so that if we have anything.
Mm.
So I think that's it. Yeah. So should we call it or wait for
Yeah,
another question?
I leave it to you, Darshan.
There is one application, so let me pop it up.
Okay, fine, fine. Thank you so much.
So I think we have come to the end, and also the last session on the nine masters or the nine treasures. So I think we have left with Kailash Mukherjee. Uh, So, so it is on the next month, and a lovely day that is on February 14th.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Darshan. Thank you all the people who listened in.
Thank you so much on behalf of National Gallery of Modern Art, Bengaluru, and Ministry of Culture. Thank you, Man, for this very insightful. I mean, it was quite precise and it was very easy to get through Nicholas, Rorik, Helena, because it's not easy. It's very wide, as you said, and their travel and expedition is not easy to capture in an hour, and it was very beautifully done. So I thank you from the bottom of the heart, and we'll catch up next month.
Yes. Thank you so much, Darshan. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Ah